Have you ever considered how just one political figure can send these ripples, through the whole political scene, both here and even like internationally?
It's really something, isn't it? How a single person can spark such different reactions and really start reshaping conversations, especially on the left.
Right. So today we're doing a deep dive into something called the Zohran Effect. It's a term that seems to be popping up more and more in political
Yeah,
discussions.
it's gaining traction.
Exactly. We're going to sift through the sources we have here to understand, okay, who is Zohran Mamdani? What exactly is this effect?
Hmm.
We'll look at the key moments, the flashpoints, how people are seeing it around the world, and where it might be heading
And our goal really is to give you those crucial insights, kind of cut through the noise.
without the information overload.
Exactly. Because what's so interesting, I think, is looking at how one person can do this. It's not just what he's doing, but why it seems to matter so much in the bigger picture, politically speaking. We'll pull out those key nuggets from the sources.
Okay, so let's start with the person right at the center of it all. Who is Zohran Mamdani?
Right. So he's Zohran Mamdani. He's a member of the New York State Assembly.
Representing District 36, that's Astoria in Queens, and he's affiliated with the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America.
And his background, well, it gives a unique perspective, doesn't it? He has Ugandan Indian heritage. His parents are the well-known scholar Mahmoud Mamdani and the filmmaker Mira Nair.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And he was elected back in 2020.
And his platform seems absolutely key to understanding this whole effect. He's pushing for things like housing for all, fare-free public transit.
Big goals.
Yeah, big goals, strong anti-gentrification measures. And he's been very outspoken on Palestinian solidarity and anti-imperialism.
And that's a really critical point. The sources we looked at paint him as a kind of movement politician.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, it means his approach isn't just about winning elections in the traditional way. It's deeply tied into grassroots, organizing, mobilizing people, building power sort of from the ground up. It's quite different from standard campaigns.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's dig into the Zohran effect itself then. What are its main features?
Well, one of the biggest things seems to be how it shifts the political conversation.
How so?
Well, his positions are pretty bold, right? Calling for full sanctions on Israel, ending U.S. military aid there. That's not just progressive. It's a real step away from where many Democrats have been, especially on foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
And things like backing good cause eviction really strongly. That policy really shifts power to tenants, often faces huge pushback from, real estate, or pushing for a fare-free MTA, the transit system. That challenges the whole funding model. These kinds of stances, they force other politicians, even moderates in his own party, to react, to maybe even adjust their own positions.
It's like you said, it forces a rethink, like dropping a stone in a pond, the ripples just spread out.
Exactly. It's not just about policy. It's about pushing for a systemic reevaluation.
And you mentioned this isn't just a U.S. thing.
No, not at all. His message seems to be finding an audience way beyond the U.S. The sources talk about transnational solidarity. He seems to be connecting with progressive movements in places like the UK, South Africa, India, Latin America. The material even draws lines to figures like Jeremy Corbyn or Chile's of Gabriel Boric.
Wow.
Yeah, it shows how these ideas can cross borders and maybe inspire similar efforts elsewhere.
And there's also something about funding, right? Disrupting the usual way campaigns are paid for.
Yes, that's crucial. It's a key part of this effect. He, like other DSA politicians, makes a point of refusing corporate donations.
Why is that so significant?
Well, it's not just about, clean money. It's strategic. It tries to lessen the grip that big donors traditionally have on policy and, frankly, on media narratives. It shifts the power dynamic more towards grassroots support. That itself is a pretty big statement about political strategy today.
And he seems to have built a really diverse base of support, especially in New York City. How has he done that?
The sources really emphasize his success in mobilizing communities that are often marginalized. He's built strong ties with immigrant groups, Muslims, African diaspora communities, and also, interestingly, with younger Jewish anti-Zionists in New York. It really points towards a model for maybe a new kind of multiracial progressive coalition, finding common ground on these core progressive ideas.
So beyond the policies, there were specific moments, right, flashpoints, where this effect really became noticeable.
Definitely. One of the biggest was his response to the 2023-24 Gaza war. He was very early and very clear in calling for a full boycott of Israeli institutions and for putting conditions on U.S. aid to Israel.
That must have caused a stir.
Oh, absolutely. It drew a lot of praise from some, obviously, but also really intense condemnation from others. It really marked him out as having a distinct, maybe even challenging voice on the world stage.
The sources also talked about something hypothetical, a potential UN speech in 2025. Sounded like it could be a big deal.
Yeah, that's framed as a kind of marker of his rising international profile.
Wow.
The scenario involves him being invited to speak at a UN youth forum about settler colonialism.
Okay.
And the thinking was this could be a kind of Greta Thunberg moment for the anti-imperialist left, something that really grabs international attention and cements his role as a voice for those kinds of global movements.
And naturally, actions like these brought reactions from all over the world. Who was supportive?
Well, you had figures like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, who talked about his clarity and justice. Ilhan Omar here in the US said he was unafraid to speak truth to empire. And Arundhati Roy from India commented on the need for people who challenge colonial continuities. So these endorsements really show that resonance across borders we talked about.
But of course, there would be strong criticism, too. Who were the main voices pushing back?
Oh, definitely. The opposition was, and is, very vocal. AIPAC, for instance, labeled him a dangerous radical and actively backed his opponents.
Right.
Here in the U.S., you had outlets like the New York Post calling him an anti-American socialist sympathizer, trying to link him to urban decay.
Standard playbook stuff, maybe?
Perhaps. And then in Europe, you had French centrists, reported via Le Monde, worrying about radical left populism, potentially upsetting traditional alliances. So unease about his impact on geopolitics, too.
And the media coverage itself sounds like it was all over the map.
It really was, and it's quite telling, actually. It almost perfectly mirrors those global political divides. You had The Intercept being generally supportive, taking on empire.
Okay.
The New York Times was more, let's say, cautious, analytical. The Progressive Dilemma. Fox News, predictably alarmist, face of America's radical future.
Right.
Al Jazeera was quite favorable. New American voice for the global South. And the BBC took a more analytical stance, a generational rethink of empire. It's like he's become a sort of Rorschach test for how different people see the future of progressivism and global power.
So, thinking about the future then, what could the Zohran Effect mean for politics here in the U.S.?
Well, the sources suggest a few possibilities.
Yeah.
One is potentially more fracturing within the Democratic Party, deeper splits between progressives and centrists.
Okay.
We might also see progressive ideas gaining more policy traction, things like rent control becoming more mainstream, more talk about demilitarization, definitely more scrutiny on foreign aid.
And more challenges in primaries.
That's anticipated too, yes. More left-wing candidates trying to take on centrist incumbents, using that grassroots playbook Mamdani exemplifies.
And what about internationally? What ripple effects could we see there?
Internationally, there's talk of maybe increased South solidarity. Emerging nations finding common cause with progressive voices in the West, like Mamdani. It could also prompt a rethinking of U.S. foreign policy. Maybe moving away from just unconditional support for certain longtime allies, especially those with difficult human rights records, and potentially more mobilization among diaspora communities globally, getting more involved politically both back home and where they live now.
And it seems like technology and media are a big part of his strategy.
Absolutely pivotal. He's really good at using social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, for getting the message out fast, for mobilizing people quickly, and for pushing back against critical narratives, bypassing traditional media.
The gatekeepers.
Exactly. And he's part of this wave embracing alternative media podcasters, YouTubers, Substack writers, going direct to audiences, the different way of doing political communication.
But look, any movement like this faces huge hurdles, right?
Yeah.
What are the main challenges for the Zohran Effect?
Oh, for sure. There are significant obstacles. The sources mentioned security threats, surveillance, smear campaigns, maybe even personal safety concerns, given how controversial some positions are.
That's serious.
It is. Then there's always the challenge of electoral viability in the U.S. system. It still heavily favors incumbents and, well, big money. So relying on grassroots funding is always an uphill climb.
Right.
And finally, just the risk of persistent hostility from mainstream media, painting him as too radical, which could limit his appeal or the appeal of similar figures nationally.
The sources laid out some strategic forecasts looking ahead to maybe 2025, 2030. What kind of scenarios did they suggest?
Yeah, they projected a few things with different likelihoods. like a medium chance of Mamdani winning a citywide office in NYC by 2026. That would be a big step up.
Potentially setting up a mayoral run down the line.
Possibly. They also saw a high likelihood of the progressive bloc in Congress growing by 2028, driven by younger voters, minority voters, a real demographic push.
Okay.
By 2030, maybe a medium chance of a DSA-backed coalition actually controlling a state legislature somewhere, kind of like models in Spain or Chile, maybe Germany's Greens. And maybe a low to medium chance of Zohran himself entering national Democratic primaries by 2032. Even if he didn't win, that would likely energize the party's left wing significantly.
So it's really about building from local up to national.
That seems to be the blueprint, yes. Leveraging local power to build national influence, rather than the old top-down way. It's a grassroots strategy for a national movement.
So, wrapping this up, what does it all mean? I mean, the Zohran Effect gives us a pretty clear picture of the struggles, but also the possibilities for progressive politics right now. It really makes you think about how political engagement might be changing, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And maybe this leaves an important question for you, our listener. When you see these strong polarized reactions and these bold stances from figures like Zohran Mamdani, how do you think that balance is shifting? The balance between, say, traditional political power and money, and the power of these mobilized communities trying to shape policy for the future?